Book 54 of 2020 was If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. So this was a book club nomination and I did vote for it. It sounded really, really good and I'm glad that I did because I really enjoyed it. If you like Shakespeare, I think you'll like this book. I am a big fan of Shakespeare. Studied Hamlet at A-level. I've read quite a few of the plays. Obviously read Macbeth when I was in year 9, but I've on my own read Romeo and Juliet. I've read Taming of the Shrew. I read Twelfth Night at GCSE as well. I love that play. I've read Othello. I think I've read The Tempest. Just read quite a few. I've seen Midsummer Night's Dream. Maybe that one. That's what I read actually, not Taming of the Shrew. I've watched Midsummer Night's Dream at the Globe. I've seen Hamlet with Benedict Cumberbatch. I don't really know how you say his name. I've seen The Tempest, National Theatre, I think, on the cinema. I like Shakespeare, right? So I like this book because you're immersed straight away in Shakespearean theatre. The 7 players, so the 7 main characters, are Shakespearean actors. And it's interesting because the characters are kind of grappling with their own identity because they're kind of coming of age, you know, they're like, I think like 17 or 18, about that age, I think. Could be wrong because it's American. So they're grappling kind of with their identity, and it's kind of like they play certain characters. So they're always playing the kind of the tropes, the Shakespearean tropes. They're always playing the kind of same characters, and then kind of almost getting enmeshed in those characters, so they can't really distinguish between what's a character and what's them, and that's kind of what's happening to them throughout the book. And we're kind of seeing like the relationships with the other kind of characters, and it's interesting in a kind of dramatic irony kind of way. The things that they're going through is kind of like what's in Shakespeare plays. So it's almost like Rio is making Shakespeare more accessible to other audiences by having this kind of story in prose, because it's using a lot of the things that Shakespeare uses that people who like Shakespeare will recognise in it. I think if people don't like Shakespeare and they don't know about Shakespeare, they're not going to spot this. It's not obvious. It's like you've got to have an understanding of Shakespeare to see kind of what she's doing. I think from the way that she's kind of wrote this book, she must have experience acting and being a Shakespearean actress or actor, whatever you want to say, because in here there is a lot of kind of quotation of various plays that they're kind of acting out as part of the story, but she deconstructs them in a way. So there's like a scene where they're learning kind of like how to act certain scenes, and when they first come to the scenes, they're not really kind of like hitting on the emotion that they need to bring to it. And so there's a kind of character who's, you know, teaching them how to do it, that is kind of manipulating them emotionally to get them to bring life to this scene. And the way that it's kind of explained is really good, because I think sometimes people don't have an appreciation for Shakespeare because they learn it at school and they probably don't pay much attention when they're actually, you know, learning about it, or maybe they don't have a great teacher, whatever. It's never meant to be read. It's supposed to be acted out. Like, you're supposed to see Shakespeare. You're not supposed to read it. And the reason you're supposed to see it is because when you see it, you get the context and the kind of intonation and the language and how it's said. You know, sometimes when you're listening to a Shakespeare in a play, you might not fully understand what's kind of being said exactly, but you kind of can figure out kind of what's going on based on the way things are being said. You know, you can kind of, through osmosis, kind of figure out like what things are like happening and how people are interacting with each other and stuff, which is missing if you just read it on the page. And you know, Shakespeare was a playwright. He wasn't a novelist, so these plays should be acted out for you to get a true appreciation of them and a true understanding of them. I think it's very, very difficult to understand them if you're reading them. It's particularly because it's quite archaic language. So the fact that she kind of deconstructs those scenes and comments on them and, you know, brings them to life a bit, I think that made it kind of a lot more accessible if you know, weren't kind of comfortable with Shakespeare. Something that was brought up actually in book club was that there's a lot of people who were kind of commenting that the Shakespeare was a bit above their head, which was interesting because I didn't have that perception of it. I thought it was quite accessible from the way that it was broken down, but perhaps not. Like, perhaps that's because I've got that kind of understanding of Shakespeare. But I feel like you don't necessarily need to have the understanding of Shakespeare to get the book, because what happens is they kind of quote Shakespeare and then they kind of explain what it was in the prose. So even if you didn't get the Shakespeare, it's explained underneath it, which for someone that gets Shakespeare, it was a little bit, oh, she's saying the same thing again. So I think if you do get Shakespeare, this maybe would have bits in it that are quite negative, but then that makes it more accessible to everybody else. So I guess you can weigh that up. But I mean, I still enjoy it, which is why I gave it a 4 and not a 5-star. Rio kind of initially like propulses you into the kind of 7 players in a way that's kind of like there's a lot of characters, but it's good because it's kind of an authentic development with the relationships with the characters, because you gradually exposed to them and you kind of build up a picture of who they are by kind of interacting with them as you would when you kind of meet people. So I thought that was a great way to introduce characters. You know, not a lot of books do that. They're very kind of formulaic and kind of introduce them in a systematic way, which is not like real life. Like in a real life situation, you'd be kind of, you know, you'd be building up pictures of people the more that you spend time with them, which is what that kind of this book does, which is really good. And the framing is good as well, in the sense that it begins with, so one of the characters is called Oliver, and he's incarcerated, and he's having kind of conversations with a Detective Colborne. Detective Colborne's kind of trying to find out what happened because somebody gets murdered, and they're trying to figure out like what's kind of happening and why. And it's almost like you kind of know what's happened, but you don't really know for sure, and you don't know if you can trust what Oliver's saying and how it's been presented. And so it gives you that kind of forward momentum through it, because as you're getting to know them, you're also realizing that you're kind of understanding how things have led up to that event and, you know, what's happened, because obviously they all start off friends. So how's somebody been murdered, and how's he the one that's been incarcerated, because his character doesn't seem like the kind of person that would murder somebody. And what's really, really good about this book is that Rio is adopting kind of character tropes, so Shakespearean character tropes, in the sense that a lot of Shakespearean characters, particularly the ones that are kind of the main characters, which, you know, these are main characters of this book, there's always a question of identity. There's always a kind of question of the current circumstances and the fact that what they thought was right is not right anymore. And so this is kind of, you know, played out in the different characters. And as well, there's kind of a question of fate and predeterminism, which again is a very like particular trope of Shakespeare. So for example, in Hamlet ends up almost kind of leading to his own death, because he can't stop thinking about everything that's happened, and he kind of makes it worse for himself. And that's what Oliver does in this book. Like, he literally doesn't have the ability to maintain composure, and neither do any of the other characters, which again is a Shakespearean trope. It's, you know, for example, like Lady Macbeth, where she's always washing her hands because she thinks that there's blood on it. There's no blood there. No one knows that you killed them. Like, if you just maintain composure, you'll get away with it. But they don't. So, you know, and Othello, he creates this kind of, you know, story that his actual daughter that is nice to him is not nice to him, and the other two are nice. And it's always the case where Shakespearean characters create the mess that they end up in. And so it's kind of like alluding to that, which I really liked. And so I think that overall it's a really, really good book, and Rio's kind of attempting to present Shakespeare in a way that's accessible through prose to a wider audience, and I think she does it really well. So I would definitely recommend to read it. I've been recommending it to people to read anyway, so, you know, it's worth a read, I think.